Hi everyone, thank you for joining me. My name's Elena Leyshon and I'm the Graduate Trainee Archivist at the North Yorkshire County Record Office in Northallerton. I've recorded this talk as part of a wide programme of online events coordinated by North Yorkshire County Libraries to celebrate Local History Month, which runs throughout the month of May. The North Yorkshire County Record Office has recently reopened its doors to the public after being closed for over a year due to COVID-19 restrictions, and it's been great to welcome people back to our search room so they can explore the wide array of records we hold here relating to the history of North Yorkshire. But today I'm here to talk to you about our recent project, Made in North Yorkshire. I've got a PowerPoint and some videos here to share with you all that will explain a bit more about the project and its aims. Made in North Yorkshire is a series of campaigns that will tell the stories of North Yorkshire's people and places. Myself and the communications graduate, Jessica Highfield, have worked in collaboration on the project since January 2020, researching and discovering records held within our archives and working with local history groups and members of the public. The first edition of the series was entitled Great North Yorkshire Sons and Daughters and aimed to explore the lives of 10 important but widely unknown people from our county's history. This included people who were either born in North Yorkshire or people who moved here and made a difference to our county. We hoped the project would shine a light on North Yorkshire's rich history and would give members of the public and local history groups the opportunity to share their local stories and memories of these great people. To kickstart the project, myself and Jessica approached local history groups and the wider public through press releases, social media, mailing lists, radio, and the NY Now newsletter to inform them of the project and to encourage nominations from local communities. The response in the first few weeks was overwhelming as our inbox became flooded with fascinating stories and suggestions. Over several months, we shortlisted these nominations down to our final 10 Great North Yorkshire Sons and Daughters, and worked with local history groups and institutions to learn more about the lives of these remarkable people. I'm now going to share the stories of our final 10 nominees to explore what makes them Great North Yorkshire Sons and Daughters. Our first nominee is VAD nurse Ursula Lascelles, who travelled from the rural North Yorkshire village of Slingsby to the battlefields of France to support the war effort during World War I. Ursula Lascelles was born in Sheriff Hutton in 1890 and died in 1992, aged 102. She was the daughter of the local vicar of Sheriff Hutton and was educated at the Girls' Grammar School in York. A photograph of her is shown on this slide, alongside a recent image of her home at Slingsby Heights in Slingsby, North Yorkshire. At the outbreak of World War I, Ursula, aged 24 years old, and her mother, Elizabeth Lascelles, began volunteering as VAD nurses. The VAD, or Voluntary Aid Detachment Nurse, was a role created by the Red Cross during the First World War. VAD nurses were voluntary nurses who helped care for injured soldiers in military hospitals across the UK and Europe. Their duties included dressing patients' wounds, which could be more than twice a day, giving patients medicine and bed baths, as well as tasks including making beds and tidying the wards. Ursula began volunteering at the British Red Cross Hospital in Swinton Grange near Moulton. Whilst volunteering in North Yorkshire, Ursula put herself forward to nurse on the front line in France. In 1917, she was accepted to work at a hospital in Rouen, France, where she worked as a VAD nurse until 1919. After the First World War and throughout her life, Ursula continued to fundraise for the British Red Cross. The influence Ursula had upon the patients she treated is evident in the records held in the North Yorkshire County Record Office. The Lascelles family collection includes hundreds of letters from soldiers she had looked after, thanking Ursula for her care. Ursula kept in contact with many soldiers for several decades after the First World War, showing how thankful the soldiers were to have had Ursula by their side in their time of need. The County Record Office also holds Ursula's nursing autograph books, which include messages of thanks from the patients she had looked after whilst they were at the hospital. Some extracts from these can be seen on this slide. The image on the left is taken from Ursula's nursing autograph book and is an entry from New Zealand soldier Sergeant Piper. His entry includes an incredible pressed poppy from the fields of the Battle of the Somme in 1916. The image on the right is another entry from Ursula's World War I nursing book from a J. Elverston. It reads, just a soldier who considers it an honour to be allowed to tender his humble and heartfelt thanks for the warm sympathy and kindly attention showed by a little lady nurse whose smile acts as a tonic and whose heart is in the right place. These records show the impact that Ursula had on these soldiers' lives on a global scale. We spoke to Margaret McKinder, coordinator of Slingsby Local History Group, who knew Ursula, or Miss Lascelles, as those in the village called her, during the latter years of her life. Here is what she had to say about Ursula's legacy.
I met Ursula when I moved to the village with my husband in 1978. Ursula had a quite sort of dominant role in the village in that she knew and understood everything that was going on. And at that time, there weren't very many newcomers to the village. There was no new housing developments or anything. And so she made it her business to find out about people who came to the village. And so we were invited to tea fairly early on to meet her and look at the house and look at the treasures she had there. She was quite a strong-willed little old lady. She was a forceful character, even though she was very small, and I think everybody, she was highly respected because of that. But they were also very hands-on in their own way. She was always in there with the best of them. Although she'd lived at home all her life, apart from the time when she was a VAD and eventually got to Belgium, she saw it very much as her duty to look after her brother Lionel, who came home from the war in a pretty shell-shocked state by the sound of it, reading between the lines. It started off with her work as a VAD, when she started writing to soldiers and the wounded people she met, and keeping records of what she was doing and what she was up to. And then she carried on writing, really, and she collected it's slightly sort of random at times. She collected newspaper articles and commented on them, commented on things that were going on in the village, collected stuff, for example, as to what people ate at village functions and what went on and who was doing what. And all this is a wonderful archive, really, of village life. And I think it's a huge contribution, really, to the sort of record of North Yorkshire life over a period of about 80 years.
Our second great North Yorkshire son or daughter is Sir George Cayley. Known as the father of flight, Cayley was born and raised within the county of North Yorkshire. George Cayley was born in 1773 in the Paradise area of Scarborough. He died in Brompton by Sordon in 1857, aged 83 years old. During his childhood in Brompton by Sordon, he was educated by tutors, and his mother, Isabella, ensured his education focused on mathematics and physics. Surrounded by North Yorkshire's nature and wildlife, George Cayley was an inquisitive child who took inspiration for his inventions from the rural landscapes and birds surrounding him. Dr. Mary Jones, resident of Brompton by Sordon, began to imagine some of the stories and scenarios George may have found himself in as a child in the village, and last year published these ideas in a children's book entitled George Cayley's Curious Summer. Here's Dr. Mary Jones explaining more about her book and George Cayley's early life.
When George was 19, both his father and grandfather died, and he moved into Brompton Hall. And he had a workshop built here where he could do his inventions, and that's where we're sitting at the moment. And you can see that as you drive along the road. And the house, which is now a school, had a very tall staircase, which is still there. And he did some of his inventions on flight from the top of the staircase. So I imagine him as a child picking up sycamore seeds first and letting them fly down from the top to the bottom. I became really fascinated by Sir George Cayley once I was drawn into the celebrations of flight. And at the time I was a governor of Brompton and Sordon Community Primary School. And the then head teacher said that there was nothing written for children about Sir George. And when there wasn't the internet then, but when you did research, it was mainly books for adults about flight and aviation. And so I decided I would try to write something. I think that he, like all children, was curious about the world around him. Here in Brompton, we're surrounded by nature, and he would have watched birds flying, and nobody worked out how to fly. At that time, everybody thought you had to flap and didn't realise that planes could have rigid wings. But he made lots of other inventions, and they are inspired by the world around him. Everything that he saw, he worked out. He wanted to work out how it worked, and if he could, to improve it. I think Sir George is a great North Yorkshire son because he showed all the qualities of a dogged determination not to give up, which I think you see in many Yorkshire people. And he did all his inventions here in a Yorkshire village, and it shows that wherever you live, you can become a great inventor.
Throughout his life, Sir George Cayley created many inventions which over time have been developed to become things which we now use and take for granted in our day-to-day lives. This includes the creation of the first artificial hand in 1836, a design for which you can see at the top of this slide, and a seatbelt which was later used on trains in 1840. Vivian Bairstow is a life member of Brompton Local History Society and is married to the fourth great-granddaughter of Sir George Cayley. He spoke to us to tell us more about Sir George, his life in Brompton, and his many, many inventions.
I was brought up about 5 miles from Heathrow and was always interested in aircraft. And when I met my wife-to-be, I asked her, as anyone does, where do you live? And she said, I live in the south, but sometimes I'm in a village in Yorkshire you would never have heard of, called Brompton. And I said, isn't that where Sir George Cayley flew his aeroplane, the first man-carrying aeroplane in the world? And she said, yes, how did you know that? And then love developed. Unfortunately, he's not widely known across the world, so some people know him very well. When we went to the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, the curator there of the historic aviation exhibits couldn't get over the fact that he was actually holding the hand of my wife and shaking it because she was of a direct descendant of Sir George Cayley. He was just light years ahead of other people with his inventions and also his philanthropy and wanting to help other people. And I think he stands head and shoulders above so many other people for many of his inventions, which were very often driven by him being tugged at the heartstrings by accidents that happened in his way of trying to correct them and help people in future who might have suffered as a result of some disaster. In 1805, he set up a cottage allotment scheme for his tenants so that they could all have a fair and equal bit of land on which to grow crops and graze animals. So he was thinking all the time of his tenants and trying to help people. In 1837, the son of one of his tenants lost his hand in the village sawmill, and so he invented the world's first practical artificial hand. A defining moment when something happened which shook the world. He produced a 3-part paper which was published to the world of the principles of aerodynamics. And everyone around the world in aviation recognises that as the most authoritative early document on how things fly. So quite a man, and that's why I think everyone should revere him as a famous son of North Yorkshire.
Out of all of his creations, Sir George Cayley is best known for his revolutionary theories surrounding aviation. In 1853, he made history when he flew the world's first human-carrying glider across Brompton Dale. At almost 80 years old, Sir George Cayley considered himself too old to fly the glider himself, and instead he ordered his coachman to fly the glider, who upon a bumpy landing said, "Please, Sir George, I wish to give notice, I was hired to drive and not to fly." Nonetheless, Sir George Cayley had achieved something world-changing. Only 50 years after his breakthrough in 1903, the Wright brothers flew the first powered flight in America. The Wright brothers credited Cayley's discovery, as Cayley himself was already aware of the need of an engine to sustain flight. Sir George Cayley was a great philanthropist and political thinker. He was also one of the early founding members and vice president of the Yorkshire Philosophical Society. The society was established in 1822 to promote the public understanding of the sciences. The society still exists today, and we spoke to Andy Marvin, council member of the Yorkshire Philosophical Society and glider pilot, to learn more about the society and Sir George's influence upon aviation.
So George Cayley is the father of flight in the modern sense, because his development, his understanding of the way in which aeroplanes could fly was absolutely fundamental. In fact, the Wright brothers in 1903 referred to Sir George Cayley as one of their inspirations. And he was the first person to recognise the four fundamental forces involved in flight, which is the weight of the aeroplane, that's offset by the lift of the wing. There's the drag of pulling the aeroplane through the air, which is offset by the thrust of the engine. So drag, thrust, lift and weight are the four forces that govern the way in which an aeroplane flies. And that governs the way in which an A380 Airbus flies, just in the same way that it governs the way in which a glider flies or any other aeroplane. And so George got that in 1804. In fact, he got it earlier. 1799, he was beginning to see these things happening. The Yorkshire Philosophical Society was founded nearly 200 years ago. 2022 is our 200th anniversary. And it's a philosophical society in the 18th century meaning of the word, if you like. It's science. So it's a society for people who are curious about things, people who are interested in things, across the whole spectrum of science, from sort of fundamental particle physics through to the social sciences. So George Cayley was one of the early members of the Yorkshire Philosophical Society. I understand he was in France when the society was formed in 1822, but he joined very soon after that and was one of the early vice presidents of the society. And he always supported the society very strongly. When he moved to London, he founded the Regent Street Polytechnic Institute, which I think is now part of the University of Westminster. So along with his scientific work, he was always interested in the promotion of science, promotion of knowledge to the general public. He was a true creative. He was an engineer with a good fundamental science background. And that's the most creative thing you can possibly be, really. And so that, in my mind, gives him every right to sort of say he's a true good North Yorkshire son.
Our third great North Yorkshire son or daughter come in a pair, and our brothers Richard and Cherry Kearton. The brothers were born in the tiny Swaledale village of Thwaite and went on to become global pioneers of early wildlife photography. You can see Cherry Kearton hanging from a cliff edge on the photo on the left, and his elder brother Richard Kearton with birds on his head on the right. The brothers came from humble roots. Day-to-day life, as well as the surrounding landscape, could be harsh, but also offered great opportunity for inspiration and adventure. The brothers' father, John, also known as Jack Kearton, taught the brothers where to find birds' nests and how to identify different bird songs. Their grandfather, Cherry, was a keen fisherman and would take both boys out to teach them how to fish. The brothers spent their childhood surrounded by people with a shared passion for the natural world. We spoke to Helen Guy, trustee of the Keld Resource Centre, to find out more about the Kearton brothers and why they are great North Yorkshire sons.
So Richard and Cherry Kearton were born literally half a mile from here in the next village of Thwaite at a time when the lead mines were in decline and there was a lot of poverty. But they had a real rich heritage in terms of the surrounding countryside. Their grandfather and father taught them a lot about nature, and they spent their days on the moors looking at the streams, and this was something that I think created a lifelong interest in the natural world. As part of our research, we wrote to both Sir David Attenborough and Chris Packham, and they both replied, and particularly David Attenborough said it was because of particularly Cherry Kearton that he became inspired to go into the field of wildlife photography and nature programs, and to think that, you know, two boys from a very remote Dales village went on to become pioneers in wildlife photography and sharing their knowledge with the general public is quite astounding, really. So the brothers were the first to actually photograph birds in situ in their natural environment on the nest. When they first suggested doing this, it was met with an outcry of disbelief, and they were told it was probably impossible. So they developed some natural hides so that they could sit and wait for the birds to return to the nest to start to capture some of the images. They never ever lost their connection with Swaledale and North Yorkshire. It was something very dear to them. They always talked about it in their public talks. Richard, you know, would come, and Cherry would come back from Mucus Show. They'd come back to visit friends here, and they still kept a very active interest in life in the Dales because a lot of their relatives were still here. But I think, you know, anybody who looked at their work can't help but make that connection that they were inspired by their childhood environment and surroundings.
The brothers always pushed themselves and the limits of the photographic technology available at the time. To achieve many of the wildlife photographs that they captured, they created natural hides where they could sit and wait for birds and other animals to return to their habitats whilst in disguise. The hides included an artificial ox, which you can see in the bottom left of this slide, which they constructed with the help of a taxidermist and covered in ox skin. The brothers would crouch inside the ox and position the camera on top of a wooden frame inside and wait patiently for the right shot. As a result of their techniques, in 1892, the brothers became the first to take a photograph of a bird's nest with eggs inside, which you can see to the right of this slide. The brothers had to overcome many physical obstacles to capture the shots they did. This included climbing sheer cliffs and waiting patiently for hours inside often claustrophobic conditions without moving for hours. They were utterly committed to getting the perfect photograph, no matter the risk. Both Cherry and Richard Kearton have been described as conservationists and ahead of their time, as through their photography, they wanted to promote the idea of seeing animals alive rather than hunting to kill, as was popular at the time. Number 4 on our list is Dr. Williams Pickles, an epidemiologist who spent over 50 years of his life as the local GP in Aysgarth, Wensleydale. He dedicated his life to investigating disease and epidemics, studying the science behind incubation periods of infectious diseases, and his work as an epidemiologist is highly relevant to the COVID-19 outbreak that we are currently facing across the world. Once qualified as a doctor in 1910, Dr. Pickles worked at several GP surgeries across the North Riding, including Bedale. In 1913, Dr. Pickles, with his partner GP, Dr. Dean Dunbar, bought the Aysgarth practice, where he looked after around 3,000 people in the village and surrounding area. Dr. Pickles served in the First World War, joining the Royal Navy as a surgeon in April 1914. He also helped set up a local VAD scheme in Aysgarth, recruiting 20 VAD, voluntary aid detachment nurses, to help support the war effort at home. Alongside his duty as a local GP, Dr. Pickles spent much of his time researching the incubation periods, epidemics, and the spread of disease with his wife Gertie, seen in the bottom photo on this slide. He recorded and analysed data for every epidemic that occurred in Aysgarth for over 20 years, including measles, influenza, and jaundice outbreaks. In 1939, Dr. Pickles published Epidemiology in County Practice, which can be seen to the right of this page. Epidemiology in country practice has been recognised as an essential source in the study of epidemiology and promoted the idea of practical, real-life research as a way of achieving medical breakthrough. While some medical advice has changed and advanced since Dr. Pickles' research, his advice for preventing the spread of the common cold was to keep away from other folk, advice which is all too familiar today. Despite his global fame, Dr. Pickles remained a country doctor and was once described as Britain's friendliest GP. For locals in Wensleydale, Dr. Pickles was their family doctor for generations, a dependable and familiar face for over 50 years. Dr. Pickles' biographer, John Pemberton, quoted Dr. Pickles in the following: "And as I watched the evening train creeping up the valley, with its pauses at our 3 stations, a quaint thought came into my head, and it was that there was hardly a man, woman, or child in all those villages of whom I did not know their Christian name, and with whom I was not on terms of intimate friendship. My wife and I say we know most of the dogs, and indeed some of the cats." Our next great North Yorkshire son or daughter nominee is Bridget Talbot. Born in 1885, Bridget Talbot was a political campaigner, inventor, and World War I VAD nurse. At the outbreak of World War I, Bridget was 29 years old. By this stage, she had already begun campaigning for causes including road safety and providing help for the unemployed. Bridget also volunteered for the Red Cross, and in 1914 she became a VAD, voluntary aid attachment nurse, and a copy of her VAD certificate, which was sent to us by Kipling Hall, can be seen to the right of this slide. Bridget had a great passion for the sea, but was also aware of the risks and dangers. This knowledge led her to invent a watertight torch that could be used to rescue naval crew and boats at sea, especially at night. Believing so strongly in her design, Bridget campaigned for several years for her invention to be recognised. Bridget's persistence paid off, and eventually the torch was made a compulsory addition to all life belts for men serving in the Navy and the Royal Air Force. Her invention saved hundreds of lives during World War II. Bridget also spent much of her life fighting to save her family home, Kipling Hall, near Scorton, North Yorkshire. Bridget's paternal uncle, Admiral Walter Carpenter, had inherited Kipling Hall in 1868, and his daughter, Sarah Carpenter, inherited the Kipling estate in 1904. Sarah and her husband had no children to pass on the estate to, and as such, Sarah sold most of the associated land and property. With little income to maintain Kipling Hall, it started to fall into disrepair, and in 1937 it was agreed that Bridget would buy Kipling Hall and its furniture from Sarah for £5,000. Bridget had a deep-rooted love for Kipling Hall and the childhood memories she had there, and she began to campaign to save it. She tried many different avenues to save Kipling, including trying to spark the interest of the National Trust. The National Trust remained uninterested, and in 1953 she wrote a pageant called Farewell to Kipling, which was repeated in 1960 and 1963. A draft copy of the Farewell to Kipling cover can be seen on this slide. After many years and setbacks, in 1968 Bridget made the decision to form a Kipling Hall Trust with the aim of preserving the history and beauty of the hall for future generations. Miss Bridget Elizabeth Talbot died at Kipling Hall in 1971, leaving the contents of the house, including many of her personal and creative possessions, to the trustees. Bridget had fulfilled her goal to save Kipling Hall, and as a result of her fierce determination, the hall still stands today as a well-loved North Yorkshire tourist attraction. Sarah Mayhew Craddock, curator at Kipling Hall, stated, "Miss Talbot could quite conceivably have lived out her days enjoying a comfortable, convivial, upper-middle-class existence. Perhaps she may have concentrating her efforts on pursuing her creative talents alone. However, something propelled Miss Talbot into the political arena from an early age." Our next nominee is a renowned Georgian architect, John Carr. Carr served as the North and West Riding Bridge Master and built or altered over 60 bridges across North Yorkshire, alongside hundreds of extravagant halls and buildings that have made North Yorkshire's architectural heritage what it is today. John Carr was born in April 1723 in Horbury, near Wakefield, in the West Riding of Yorkshire. Carr was the eldest of 9 children and came from a humble yet skilled family of masons. John received formal masonry training via an apprenticeship with his father, and this gave him a sound understanding of classic design. However, it soon became clear that John wanted to apply these theories beyond just masonry. It is believed that Carr's first commissioned building was Huthwaite Hall, not far from Carr's birthplace of Horbury. It was built in 1748 for John Cookshott, whose family owned the local ironworks. 1748 was also the year that Carr set up his own architectural practice, and from this point onwards, Carr began to establish himself as one of the most skilled and up-and-coming architects in the north of England. This slide shows John Carr's signature from 1795. Carr built up a portfolio of over 300 buildings located mostly across the north of England, and they include the North Allerton Courthouse and County Jail, which were designed by Carr in 1784. In 1772, Carr was appointed as the principal surveyor of bridges, or the bridge master, in the North Riding, with a salary of £100 a year. Carr recorded his plans and repairs of bridges in the North Riding in an annual report which he presented to the quarter sessions. The North Yorkshire County Record Office holds Carr's Book of Bridges from 1805, which includes plans and elevations for over 85 bridges in the North Riding. The first bridge Carr designed was at Massam in North Yorkshire and the last at Ferry Bridge in West Yorkshire. His bridge designs were primarily classical, with rounded arches and built as features of the landscape. This slide shows just a few examples taken from Carr's Book of Bridges. Architectural historian Dr. Ivan Hall best sums up John Carr's legacy. He said, "Carr generated an enormous output, most of which remains today, which is an outstanding achievement. None of Carr's buildings collapsed due to the lack of skill, although some owners may have not maintained them adequately. His work has stood the test of time and can still be enjoyed today." Number 7 in our list, our author trio, Marie Hartley, Ella Pontefract and Joan Ingleby. Combining their individual skills, all three women dedicated their lives to documenting the rich culture and intangible heritage of the Yorkshire Dales. Marie Hartley and Ella Pontefract, seen in the left and centre image on this slide, had been childhood neighbours and built a lifelong friendship that resulted in tours and walks around the Yorkshire Dales. These trips inspired Hartley and Pontefract to write and illustrate books on the unique way of life of the Yorkshire Dales throughout the 1930s and early 1940s. They would work together writing their books, and Marie would take photographs and produce the illustrations. In the top left corner of this slide, you can see the inside cover of Hartley and Pontefract's 1939 book, Yorkshire Tour. In this, they described what they hoped to achieve through their work. They said, "We set out on our journey to discover the spirit of the Yorkshire to which we belong." They note, "The variety of Yorkshire scenery has divided it naturally into numbers of these small districts, each with its own customs and peculiarities. In a distance of 30 miles, you find a different scene, climate, and farming system, and different looks and dialect in the people." In 1945, Ella Pontefract tragically died in her late 40s, and for a while, Marie Hartley struggled to visit places that they had written about. Later, in 1947, Marie met Joan Ingleby, born near Ripon, and together they picked up where her and Ella had left off, capturing rural Dales life. Marie and Joan focused their efforts documenting the less well-known aspects of Yorkshire Dales heritage, including fading industries like hand knitting. An image of Marie and Joan walking is shown towards the right-hand side of this slide. Often, the intangible cultural heritage of a place, its rituals, customs, language, and general way of life is regarded as less significant than protecting fixed buildings and landscapes. This is why the work of Hartley, Pontefract and Ingleby is so important to the identity of the Dales, linking its present to its past. In 1972, Hartley and Ingleby's collections of items related to Yorkshire Dales history became the basis of what is now the Dales Countryside Museum in Hawes. We spoke to Fiona Rosher, museum manager at the Dales Countryside Museum, to learn more about the legacy of the three authors. She stated, "Marie Hartley, Ella Pontefract and Joan Ingleby were pioneers in the recording of the people, places and cultural heritage of Yorkshire and the Dales in particular. Their combined skill of photographer, writer and artist created a unique impression of personal, domestic and working life in the Dales. The action they took to prevent objects leaving the region showed great foresight, and they are an inspiration to all those who work to preserve and interpret the cultural heritage of the Yorkshire Dales and beyond." Our next great North Yorkshire son or daughter is Thomas Richardson. Described as Great Ayton's greatest benefactor, Richardson was a Quaker who dedicated his life to supporting the education of the working classes across the North, or children of Quaker couples who had married outside the faith. Thomas Richardson was born into a large Quaker family in Darlington in 1771. In the 1790s, Richardson moved to London and worked his way up from a messenger in the Quaker financial services to become one of the wealthiest bankers in the city. Richardson used his wealth to support the construction of the Darlington and Stockton Railway and was one of the 6 founders of the Middlesbrough Port. Upon his retirement in 1830, Richardson decided to move to Great Ayton and built himself a home at Cleveland Lodge. In 1841, Thomas Richardson donated a large chunk of money to the creation of the North of England Agricultural School. The purpose of the school was to provide an adequate education for the children of couples across the north of England who had married outside of the Quaker Society. In 1854, the school was renamed the Friends School, a programme for which can be shown on this slide. As part of their learning and natural history classes, the students regularly went out on walks in the local area, including at nearby Rosebery Topping and Captain Cook's Monument. Once he had set up the Friends School in Great Ayton, Richardson still found ways to support the education of the children of the village, including those who weren't Quaker. In 1842, he helped to fund the opening of the British School in Great Ayton, which focused on helping poor children from the village and surrounding area. He was also responsible for rebuilding the waterfall in Great Ayton, which is shown on this slide. Richardson had an undeniable impact on the village of Great Ayton and the wider region through choosing to invest his wealth back into his home county. Representative of the Quaker values of community and equality, Richardson's greatest legacy is supporting the education of the children of North Yorkshire. We spoke to Ian Pearce of Great Ayton History Society to learn why Thomas Richardson was a great North Yorkshire son. He said, "The people of Great Ayton owe a lot to the generosity of Thomas Richardson. After he had made his home in the village, he rebuilt the dam in our river after it had been washed away, set up 2 schools and built 4 almshouses." Our next nominee is Miss Winifred Jacob Smith. Winifred and her family were extremely community-spirited and well known within the local area of Knaresborough. Alongside her invaluable contributions to the war effort during World War II, Miss Winifred Jacob Smith is perhaps best known for bequeathing Scriven Park, now Jacob Smith Park, near Knaresborough to her community upon her death in May 2003. Winifred is shown on the left-hand side photograph on this slide. At the outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939, Winifred, aged 30, and her sister Dorothy joined the Women's Land Army for North Yorkshire. The purpose of the Women's Land Army was to fill the agricultural jobs left vacant after many farmers had gone to fight in the war. The work on the farms was labour-intensive and involved long days working in the fields. After joining in 1939, Winifred soon became organiser for the Women's Land Army for North Yorkshire and later the whole of Yorkshire. The Yorkshire Museum of Farming, based at Merton Park near York, holds the archive of Miss Winifred Jacob Smith, including records from her time as organiser of the Yorkshire Women's Land Army. We spoke to Dr. Mike Tyler, curator at the Yorkshire Museum of Farming, to find out more about the importance of the Women's Land Army in supporting the war effort.
Welcome to the Yorkshire Museum of Farming. My name is Mike Tyler and I'm the curator here, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about our Women's Land Army display and gallery. This gallery and exhibition opened in 2015 to provide a home for our growing collection of Women's Land Army memorabilia and documents. And it is dedicated to a very, very underappreciated service during the Second World War, the Women's Land Army. It employed girls between the ages of 18 and 30, and what it basically acted as was a labour pool. Now, at the start of the Second World War, this country was producing, estimates are around about 30%, 1/3 of the food that we actually consumed, and considerable effort was put into improving the efficiency and the output of British agriculture. And the Women's Land Army provided a key resource in achieving that. In each region, key people were put in place, and one of the local notable figures was, of course, Winifred Jacob Smith. So she was the county organiser for North Yorkshire. She had responsibilities for interviewing new recruits, determining whether they were really up to the work. Remember, we're talking about hard physical work in all weathers. Now, under the control of the county office, the girls could then be placed wherever they could be most effective. Sometimes that could be at a farm half a mile away from where you were born. Sometimes that could be at the other end of the country. The WLA was extremely effective in moving people around, communicating with each other, assessing where the need was greatest. Beyond that, though, the regional organisation team, and specifically people like Winifred Jacob Smith, they had a pastoral responsibility for the girls as well. These girls were going on to farms and working in an entirely new role. They were there as workers. It is another step forward in this role towards female emancipation.
Tegwyn Hammersley, Education Officer at the Yorkshire Museum of Farming, also shared her thoughts.
Hi, I'm Tegwyn. I'm one of the staff here at the Yorkshire Museum of Farming, and I'm standing in front of our display of what the kind of hostel area a member of the Women's Land Army might expect to stay in. The girls who joined the Women's Land Army were often, rather than coming from your very urban areas, they'd be coming from what we call semi-rural or rural, so close to the countryside. They might have experience working on allotments or even very small family farms. But for them, a lot of them, even the ones who did grow up on farms, it would have been a very big change of life, because they were going from being members of a family working on a farm to being workers and employed at farms. One of the things that Miss Winifred Jacob Smith would have been involved in is organising training. A lot of them did very basic training for agricultural work, and that would have included at the time some level of scientific knowledge. On farms, they might have been living with the family or in a hostel like this. The rooms they would have been given were sometimes very basic, often shared with other girls. And checking on their living conditions was one of the jobs that Miss Winifred Jacob Smith would have ended up doing. A lot of the girls who ended up working in the Women's Land Army ended up being very close to the people they were working with. Some of them ended up marrying farmers or going into farming in other ways. We do know there were tensions at the end of the war between wanting work for returning male farm workers and between the women who enjoyed working in the Land Army and wanted to carry on with a lot of the work they were doing and with the independence it gave them.
In 1951, Winifred Jacob Smith received an MBE from King George VI for her leadership of the Yorkshire Women's Land Army during the Second World War. The photograph on the left shows Winifred receiving her MBE at Buckingham Palace alongside her sister Dorothy and mother Dora. Upon her death in May 2003, Winifred bequeathed what was then called Scriven Park near Nesborough to her local community for all generations to benefit from the freedom and beauty that public parks bring. Winifred left the park to Harrogate Borough Council, who continued to maintain it for the local community to enjoy, and it was officially opened to the public as Jacob Smith Park in 2008. Joe Smalley, Secretary of the Friends of the Jacob Smith Park, said, "Winifred Jacob Smith, MBE, granted us all the freedom of the park, and we must never take it for granted. The park really does greet us like an old friend every time we enter its gate, offering us safety inside its impressive stone walls as we walk in the company of ancient trees." Our final Great North Yorkshire Son or Daughter profile is Dr. Laura Beale. Born in 1867 in the village of Hampsway near Harrogate, Laura Beale went on to become the first Yorkshire woman to qualify as a doctor. Laura wanted to study medicine to become a doctor like her father and brothers. However, in the 19th century, there were still those who opposed women studying medicine. As a result, Laura Beale was initially rejected from Leeds Medical School, but was eventually accepted to study medicine at the University of London. Laura Beale qualified as a doctor at the Royal Free Hospital, London in 1904. Once qualified, Laura's first post was at the Hospital for Women and Children in Leeds. After 6 months, she returned to her hometown of Harrogate and set up a general practice at 3 Victoria Avenue, and in doing so, she became Harrogate's and indeed Yorkshire's first woman doctor. Dr. Laura Beale was passionate about improving medical care for women and children, including for those from more deprived parts of Yorkshire. Whilst working at Harrogate Infirmary, Dr. Laura Beale fought for over 25 years to establish a maternity department at the hospital. She finally achieved her goal in 1937 when a maternity department was unveiled at the hospital. In 2017, in order to remember the invaluable work of Dr. Laura Beale to her local community, Harrogate Civic Society installed the plaque shown to the left of this slide at the site of her surgery at 3 Victoria Avenue, Harrogate. Dr. Paul Jennings, a member of Harrogate Civic Society, commented, "Whilst technically born in the former West Riding of Yorkshire, she was of course a daughter of North Yorkshire. She deserves recognition as an important figure in the history of both medicine and feminism, and a key figure in medical provision, especially for women and infants, in her native county, more particularly Harrogate." Well, that's the last of our 10 great North Yorkshire sons and daughters. Once we had explored the lives of all 10 of these profiles, in February 2021, we put them to public vote to discover who the public had felt had been the most influential. We received over 200 votes from the general public, and in April 2021, the winner was announced as inventor and campaigner for Kipling Hall, Bridget Talbot. We'd like to thank you all for your contributions, and I hope you enjoyed this talk, learning more about 10 of North Yorkshire's greatest sons and daughters. The stories of all of these sons and daughters can be found at the North Yorkshire County Record Office blog at nightcrowblog.com. We are always keen for feedback and would love to hear from you if you have any ideas of what you would like to see from Made in North Yorkshire in the future, whether that's exploring great North Yorkshire market towns or local businesses, or any other ideas you have. Get in touch via email at madeinnorthyorkshire@northyorks.gov.uk. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at North_Yorkshire_archive and on Twitter at NYCC Archives. Thank you very much for listening.